coal dust never really washes off? That's something they don't tell you when you sign on, how it works its way into the creases of your knuckles, settles in the corners of your eyes, turns your snot black for hours after a shift. I'd been working the consolidated coal mine for 18 years by the time this happened, and I'd made peace with being a man permanently stained. My grandfather had the same hands, the same gray pallor to his skin that no amount of scrubbing could fix. It's the price you pay for honest work in these mountains. My name is Sebastian Bloodmoon. I know how that sounds. Like something out of a cheap paperback, the kind they sell at gas stations with wolves howling on the cover. But it's an old name, and this hollow goes back to the original German settlers who came through in the 1840s. Blutmund, they spelled it then, before the immigration officers Americanized it into something that sounds like a Halloween costume. I used to hate it as a kid. Now I don't think about it much at all. I was 42 years old, divorced for 6 years, living alone in the same clapboard house where my grandfather drew his last breath. The place needed work, always needed work, but it was paid off, and it was mine. 200 acres of steep Appalachian hollow, half of it too vertical to farm, the rest given over to a hard scrabble operation that kept me busy every hour I wasn't underground. 12 head of cattle, a small herd of goats, chickens that had more attitude than sense, 2 hound dogs named Rufus and Belle, who'd been with me longer than my marriage lasted. The hollow sits about 15 miles from the nearest town with a stoplight, down a road that the county stops maintaining after the first hard freeze. Maybe 15 families scattered through these woods. All of us related in some fashion if you go back far enough. Carson's up on the North Ridge. Whitaker's down by the creek. My cousin Ray and his wife in the old Methodist parsonage they'd converted when the church closed in 2008. We all knew each other's business, helped each other when times got lean, and minded our own when they didn't. That's how it's always been in places like this. My routine was brutal, and I'd built my life around it the way you build a fence, one post at a time, until it becomes a structure that holds you in place. Wake at 4:30. Coffee so strong it could strip paint. Then the drive over to Consolidated through 3 valleys of switchback roads. 8 hours underground. Sometimes 10 if we hit a good seam or a bad one. Drive home covered in that black dust that smells like ancient death. Because that's what coal is. Millions of years of compressed forests, the bones of a world that existed before humans drew breath. Home meant more work. The cattle needed checking. The goats needed their evening feed. The chicken coop needed its nightly securing against the foxes and raccoons that prowled the hollow. I'd eat something simple. Beans and cornbread most nights. Maybe some deer sausage from the freezer if I was feeling ambitious, and fall into bed by 9, sometimes earlier. Weekends I'd tackle the bigger jobs, fencing, equipment repair, the endless losing battle against the encroaching forest that wanted to reclaim every cleared acre my family had wrestled from this land. I was the man people called when they needed help. That's not bragging, it's just fact. When old Mrs. Carson's well pump failed at midnight, she called me. When the Whitaker boy flipped his 4-wheeler on the logging road, I was the one who drove up with my truck and a come-along to haul the thing out. When a cow got stuck in a sinkhole, and they did, more often than you'd think, the limestone underneath these mountains riddled with holes like Swiss cheese, folks knew Sebastian Bloodmoon would come with his chains and his patience and get the animal out alive, or put it down clean if there was no saving it. I'm telling you all this because I need you to understand who I was before. A practical man. A man who believed in work, in the solidity of the earth, in problems that could be solved with enough sweat and stubbornness. I didn't believe in ghost stories. I didn't believe in the old tales that got passed around at family reunions, the ones about things in the woods that the old-timers claim to have seen. I thought those were just stories people told to scare children, to keep them from wandering too far from the farmhouse after dark. I don't believe that anymore. The wrongness started in late October, though I didn't recognize it as wrongness at first. That's the thing about hindsight. It makes everything look obvious, like the universe was hanging up warning signs, and I was just too stupid to read them. But in the moment, each thing that happened had an explanation, a rational explanation. It was only when I started stacking them together that the explanation stopped making sense. Rufus and Belle were the first sign, though I didn't know what they were signaling at the time. Those dogs had been with me since they were pups, and I'd trained them myself for coon hunting. They'd treed black bears twice that I knew of, stood their ground against a rabid bobcat until I could get a clear shot, never back down from anything that walked or crawled in these mountains. They were fearless in the way that only hounds can be, all nose and instinct and absolute confidence in their place at the top of the food chain. So when they stopped going off the porch after sunset, I noticed. The first night, I thought Belle might be coming down with something. She'd been a little sluggish during the day, not eating her full portion. When dark came and she refused to follow me out to check the goat pen, I chalked it up to a stomach bug. Rufus stayed with her. They'd always been bonded that way, inseparable since puppyhood. I did the evening chores alone, didn't think much of it. But then it happened the next night, and the night after that. By the fourth evening, I was genuinely confused. Both dogs would follow me around the property during daylight hours, normal as could be. But the moment the sun dropped behind the ridge and the shadows started pooling in the hollow, they'd retreat to the porch and refuse to budge. I tried coaxing them with treats, with commands, even with anger when my patience wore thin. Rufus just whined and pressed himself against the door. And Belle did something I'd never seen her do in 8 years. She tucked her tail between her legs and urinated right there on the porch boards, trembling like she'd been beaten. I remember standing there in the gathering dark, looking at my dog, thinking, "What the hell has gotten into you?" I told myself it was nothing. Maybe they'd had a run-in with a porcupine I hadn't noticed, or caught scent of something that had spooked them. Dogs are sensitive creatures. They pick up on things humans miss. That's what makes them valuable. But as I walked to the barn alone that night, flashlight cutting through the darkness, I found myself listening harder than usual, watching the tree line more carefully, telling myself I wasn't scared, just attentive. The deer disappeared next. I didn't notice immediately. I wasn't a serious hunter anymore, too tired from the mine to spend my weekends freezing in a tree stand. But I had a salt lick set up by the far fence line that I kept stocked for the local population. Deer had been using it for years. I'd see them most mornings, does, and yearlings mostly. Sometimes a buck in the fall when the rut was starting. One evening I walked out to check on it and realized the block was exactly where I'd placed it 3 weeks earlier. Not licked down at all. The grass around it wasn't trampled. No pellets, no tracks in the soft dirt. just a salt block sitting there like a monument to something that wasn't coming back. I mentioned it to Earl Whitaker when he stopped by to borrow my post-hole digger. Earl was 73 years old, had lived in this hollow his entire life, and kept a small herd of goats on the slope behind his house. He listened to me talk about the deer, nodding slowly, and then he said something that stuck with me. Mine won't graze the upper pasture no more. Found 'em all huddled in the barn corner yesterday morning, shaking like leaves. Had to practically drag 'em out to the lower field. Upper pasture, I repeated. That's the one that borders my timber line? That's the one. We stood there for a moment, neither of us saying what we were both thinking. Then Earl picked up the post-hole digger and nodded his thanks. Probably just a cat come through, he said. Seen it before. They move on once the deer thin out. I agreed with him because agreeing was easier than examining the feeling in my gut too closely. A mountain lion made sense. We weren't supposed to have them in this part of the state anymore. The game department had declared them functionally extinct decades ago. But animals don't respect human boundaries. One could have wandered down from further north, found good hunting in the hollow, sent the prey animals into hiding and the dogs into a panic. It explained everything neatly. I walked home from the mine 3 nights later, taking the shortcut through the forest rather than the long way around by road. It was something I'd done hundreds of times, a mile-long footpath that saved me 20 minutes of driving. The leaves were down, making the going noisy, and I was tired enough that I wasn't paying close attention to anything but putting one foot in front of the other. Then I realized I couldn't hear the creek. I stopped walking. The path crossed Barlow Creek about halfway home, a shallow run of water that babbled over rocks and filled the hollow with constant white noise. At this time of year, it should have been loud with life. Frogs, insects, the occasional splash of a muskrat or turtle. Instead, there was silence. Not quiet. Silence. The absolute absence of sound that you only notice when you've been listening to something your whole life, and it suddenly isn't there. I remember thinking the cold must have driven them all underground early. But even as the thought formed, I knew it was wrong. It was October, not December. The temperature was in the 50s, and besides, I could hear my own breathing, my own footsteps on the dry leaves, so my ears were working fine. The forest itself had simply stopped. I stood there on the path, flashlight in hand, and felt something I hadn't felt since I was a small child, afraid of the dark. The absolute certainty that I was being watched. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. But the weight of attention pressed against me from somewhere in the black wall of trees, patient and immense, and profoundly wrong. I could feel it on my skin like a physical pressure, like standing too close to a fire. Except this was cold. This reached inside my chest and wrapped fingers around my lungs and squeezed just enough to let me know it could squeeze harder. I walked the rest of the way home faster than I'd walked anywhere in years. Not running, I wasn't going to run. Wouldn't give whatever it was the satisfaction, but not dawdling either. When I came out of the trees into my own back field, the spell broke like a soap bubble popping. Sound rushed back in. The wind in the bare branches, a distant owl, the creak of my own barn in the gusts. Normal sounds. Living sounds. Rufus and Belle were pressed against the door when I came up the porch steps. They didn't bark at my approach, didn't wag their tails in greeting. They just stared past me into the darkness I'd come from, ears flat against their skulls, whimpering. That night, I dug my grandfather's .30-30 out of the back of the closet. I told myself it was practical, just precaution. A mountain lion could be dangerous if cornered, and if one had moved into the territory, I should be prepared. I cleaned the rifle, loaded it, set it by the door where I could reach it quickly if needed. I wasn't scared, I told myself, just careful. But I didn't sleep more than an hour at a stretch. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of wind against the windows, brought me up out of whatever thin doze I'd managed to slip into. I kept the bedside lamp on, something I hadn't done since childhood. And when dawn finally came, gray and cold and utterly welcome, I found myself on my feet before my alarm went off, pulling on my clothes, desperate to be out of the house and down in the mine where 300 feet of solid earth would separate me from whatever had settled into my hollow. I told myself I was imagining things, just tired, just stressed from the divorce fallout, from the endless work, from the weight of a life that had grown too heavy to carry alone. I told myself all the rational things, and I almost believed them. Almost. But I kept the rifle by the door, and I stopped taking the shortcut through the woods. And every night when the darkness came pooling down from the ridges like black water filling a bowl, I found myself checking the locks twice, 3 times, looking out the windows into a hollow that had been my home my entire life and no longer felt like any place I belonged. Something had moved in, something that made the deer vanish and the dogs cower and the forest go silent when it passed. Something that watched from the darkness with patience that felt older than the mountains themselves. And it knew I was there. I was certain of that even then. It knew exactly where I was. It just hadn't decided what to do about me yet. I started looking for evidence the next morning, telling myself, that's what a reasonable man would do. A reasonable man doesn't hide in his house because the woods felt wrong one evening. A reasonable man investigates, gathers facts, solves the problem. That's what my grandfather would have done, what any of the men in my family would have done going back generations. We were practical people. We didn't spook easy. The trail cameras were my first thought. I had 3 of them set up around the property, one by the salt lick, one covering the chicken coop, and one aimed at the gap in the fence where I'd seen deer crossing onto my land. They were cheap units, nothing fancy, but they'd captured plenty of useful footage over the years. Coyotes skulking past at 3 in the morning, a black bear investigating my garbage cans, once a bobcat carrying something limp in its jaws. If something was moving through my hollow, these cameras would have seen it. I pulled the SD cards that Saturday morning, brought them inside, and plugged the first one into my laptop. The footage from the Salt Lick camera was unremarkable. Empty frame after empty frame. Timestamps marching forward through 2 weeks of nothing. No deer, which confirmed what I already knew, but also no predator. No mountain lion stalking through the frame. No explanation for why the wildlife had vanished. The chicken coop camera was the same. Chickens during the day, darkness at night, nothing unusual. I fast-forwarded through hours of footage, watching the timestamp blur past, seeing nothing but the ordinary rhythm of a farm that should have felt ordinary but somehow didn't anymore. The third camera was different. The footage started normally enough. Daylight shots of the fence gap, a few squirrels, a crow picking at something in the grass. Then the sun went down and the infrared kicked in, turning the world into that ghostly green monochrome that always made familiar places look alien. I watched the empty gap, the motionless trees beyond, the timestamp crawling past midnight. At 2:47 a.m., the image corrupted. I don't mean it glitched or stuttered. I mean it became something that shouldn't have been possible for a simple, motion-activated camera to produce. The frame filled with static, then darkness, then something else. A pattern that hurt to look at. Lines that seemed to move even in a still image. Shapes that my brain refused to process into anything coherent. I felt a headache building behind my eyes just from the few seconds I stared at it. Then the image cleared and the footage resumed normally. But just before the corruption ended for maybe 2 frames, a fraction of a second, I saw something in the darkness. 2 points of light, faint and pale, positioned at the top of the frame. Not stars, not reflections. Eyes maybe, except they were too high. The fence gap was about 4 feet tall, and these lights were above it, well above it. I rewound, paused, tried to get a clear look, but the corruption made it impossible to see anything clearly. Just those 2 faint points, there and gone, and then empty forest and a time stamp that kept marching forward as if nothing had happened. I told myself it was a malfunction, cheap camera, old SD card, maybe moisture in the housing. That's what made sense. That's what I chose to believe as I ejected the card and sat back in my chair, rubbing my temples. But I couldn't stop thinking about the height. If those were eyes, and I wasn't saying they were, just if they would have belonged to something standing 7 feet tall at minimum, maybe taller. Nothing in these woods stood that tall except trees. I mentioned the camera malfunction to Ray at the mine on Monday. We were eating lunch in the break room, both of us covered in coal dust, and I brought it up as casually as I could manage. Told him I thought a mountain lion might have moved into the hollow, that I'd been trying to get proof, but my cameras were acting up. Ray laughed. Mountain lion? Christ, Sebastian, you've been watching too many nature documentaries. Ain't been lions in these mountains since our granddaddies were boys. Something's got the deer spooked. Earl's goats, too. Probably just a big dog gone feral. That happens, you know. People dump their pets out in the country when they can't afford to feed them. They go wild, start running in packs. He took a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. Either that or some idiot's keeping a wolf hybrid. You know how people are. Think it makes them tough, having a dangerous animal. I considered this. It was a reasonable explanation, more reasonable than mine, actually. A feral dog or a wolf hybrid would explain the fear in my hounds, the flight of the deer, maybe even the silence in the forest. Wolves and their descendants had a way of changing the behavior of everything around them. It was called an apex predator effect. I'd read about it somewhere. You're probably right, I said. I'll call the game warden, see if anyone's reported anything. I did call the game warden. His name was Dave Putnam, a tired-sounding man who'd been managing wildlife complaints in this county for 20 years. He listened to my description. Missing deer, frightened livestock, possible large predator in the area, and made noises that sounded like he was taking notes. I can come out and take a look, he said, but I'll tell you right now, we haven't had any confirmed lion sightings in decades. Most likely you've got a bear that's having trouble finding enough food before hibernation. They get bold this time of year, start ranging further than normal. Might explain your deer moving off too. Bears don't usually make dogs scared to leave the porch. A pause. Your dogs won't go outside? Not after dark, not for anything. Another pause, longer this time. That is unusual, but animals are unpredictable. Could be they got into a nest of yellow jackets, associated the pain with nighttime somehow. Dogs are smart, but they're not logical, you know? I knew. I also knew my dogs had never been stung by yellow jackets, and that their fear had started the same week the forest went silent. But I didn't say that. I just thanked Dave Putnam for his time and hung up. That evening I walked to the property with the .30-30 in my hands, looking for tracks. The ground was soft from recent rain, perfect conditions for print making, and I knew every animal that lived in these woods by its footprint. Deer were obvious, delicate, and heart-shaped. Bear prints looked almost human, but with claw marks extending from the toes. Coyote and fox left neat oval depressions, dog-like but wild. I found nothing. Not nothing as in no predator tracks. Nothing as in no tracks at all. The game trails that crisscrossed my property, worn into the earth by generations of deer and other creatures, were empty. The muddy spots near the creek showed no impressions. The soft ground around my salt lick, which should have been churned into a mess of overlapping prints, was smooth and undisturbed. It was as if every living thing had simply stopped using this land, as if they'd all received a message I couldn't hear and had collectively decided to be somewhere else. I stood at the tree line as the sun began to set, watching the shadows lengthen, and felt that weight of attention settle over me again. It was subtle at first, just a prickling at the back of my neck, an awareness of being observed. But the longer I stood there, the heavier it became, until I could barely breathe under the pressure of it. The forest was watching me, or something in the forest was. I turned and walked back to the house, not running, not letting myself run, but not looking back either. Rufus and Belle were waiting on the porch, pressed together in a trembling heap, and when I opened the door, they bolted inside so fast they nearly knocked me over. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself there was a rational explanation for all of this, something mundane and ordinary that I just hadn't figured out yet. A feral dog, a bold bear, maybe some kind of chemical spill from one of the old mines that was affecting animal behavior. Something. Anything. But I locked the door that night with hands that weren't quite steady. And when I finally fell asleep, hours later, it was with the lamp on and the rifle within arm's reach. The first time I saw it, really saw it, was 3 nights later. I'd been checking the hen house, something I did twice a night now because the routine made me feel less helpless. The chickens had been restless for days, huddling together instead of spreading across their roosts, making those soft, worried sounds that birds make when they sense a predator nearby. I'd lost 2 hens in the past week, not to any visible injury, but to some kind of stress-related death that left their bodies intact, but their hearts stopped. The vet I'd called said it happened sometimes. Fear can kill animals, he'd told me. Their systems just can't handle sustained terror. It was a little after 2 in the morning when I heard something outside the coop. Not a dramatic sound. Nothing howling or growling or doing any of the things that monsters do in movies. Just a soft rustle, a displacement of air, as if something large was moving through the space between the hen house and the tree line. I had my flashlight in one hand, the .30-30 in the other. The smart thing would have been to go back inside, bar the door, and wait for morning. But I was tired of being afraid, tired of not knowing what was doing this to my animals, my dogs, my whole hollow. I needed to see it, whatever it was. I needed proof that there was something real behind all this wrongness, something with flesh and blood that could be shot or trapped or driven off. I stepped out of the hen house and raised my flashlight toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the bare trunks, the carpet of dead leaves, the empty space where nothing should have been waiting. I swept it left to right, searching for the source of the sound, seeing nothing but ordinary forest. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, evenly. Just an animal, I told myself. Just a bear or a dog, or maybe a deer that hadn't gotten the message about leaving. Then I saw the eyes. They were at the tree line, maybe 30 yards away, reflecting my flashlight's beam back at me in that way that animal eyes do at night. A sickly amber green, like pond scum catching sunlight, but wrong somehow. The color was too deep, too layered, as if I was looking into something that went back further than ordinary biology allowed. And the height. God, the height. I'm 6 feet tall. I was standing on level ground, and the hen house behind me was a little higher than the forest floor beyond the fence line. Accounting for all of that, accounting for every possible angle, those eyes were looking down at me. Not level, not below. Down. That meant whatever they belonged to was standing at least 7 feet tall, maybe 8, maybe more. I couldn't move. My flashlight hand stayed locked in position, the beam frozen on those impossible eyes, and every muscle in my body had turned to stone. This was fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not the sharp adrenaline jolt of near accidents at the mine, not the slow dread of financial trouble or health scares. This was something older, something that bypassed my conscious mind entirely and spoke directly to the animal part of my brain, the part that remembered what it meant to be prey. The eyes blinked. It was a slow blink, almost contemplative, and when they opened again, they were still fixed on me with that same patient attention. I felt like a mouse being studied by a cat, assessed and measured and found. What? Interesting? Insufficient? I couldn't read any emotion in those eyes, couldn't assign any human meaning to them. They were just watching, just waiting. Then, without any visible movement that I could track, they were gone. Not closed. Gone. As if whatever owned them had simply stepped back into a darkness too complete for my flashlight to penetrate, had melted into the forest with a silence that no 7-foot creature should have been capable of. I was left standing there, arm still raised, beam still pointed at empty trees, heart slamming against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest. I don't know how long I stood frozen. It might have been seconds, it might have been minutes. Eventually my body remembered how to move, and I backed toward the house without turning around, keeping my flashlight aimed at the tree line, keeping my rifle up, even though some part of me knew it wouldn't do a damn thing against whatever I'd just seen. Rufus and Belle were going crazy when I came through the door, not barking. They hadn't barked since this started, but whimpering and pressing against my legs, trying to push themselves between me and the windows, between me and any possible entry point. I locked every door, every window, even the ones that had been painted shut for decades. I pushed the kitchen table against the back door and dragged my grandfather's old dresser in front of the front window. Then I sat in the middle of the living room floor with my rifle across my knees and watched the dawn come, gray and slow and more welcome than any sunrise I'd ever seen in my life. I didn't go to the mine that morning. I called in sick, which I'd done maybe 5 times in 18 years, and spent the day moving through the house like a ghost, checking locks, looking out windows, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. I'd been tired. I'd been on edge from weeks of unexplained strangeness. The eyes could have been anything: an owl in an unusual perch, a raccoon that had somehow climbed higher than it should have, light reflecting off something metallic that I'd mistaken for living eyes. But I couldn't make myself believe it. The height had been too precise, too wrong. And the way those eyes had blinked, that slow and measured assessment, that wasn't random chance or mistaken perception. Something had been watching me, studying me, making decisions about me that I couldn't begin to understand. By nightfall, I'd convinced myself I was losing my mind. That was actually the more comforting option. A breakdown I could get help for, could medicate, could eventually recover from. Better to be crazy than to accept that something impossible was living in my woods. Better to be crazy than to face the implications of what I'd seen. I almost believed it too. Almost had myself talked down from the ledge of terror I'd been standing on for weeks. 3 nights later, it came back. The moon was up. Not quite full, but bright enough to paint the hollow in shades of silver and shadow. I was standing at my bedroom window, unable to sleep, watching the tree line like I'd been doing every night since the hen house. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. The forest was wrapped in that dead silence I'd grown to dread, the absence of all the small living noises that should have filled the darkness. Then something stepped out of the trees at the far fence line. I stopped breathing. My hands, which had been resting on the windowsill, clenched into fists so tight that my nails broke the skin of my palms. But I couldn't look away, couldn't move. Could only stand there and watch as my worst fears took shape in the moonlight. It was a silhouette, nothing more. A black shape against the silvered ridge, outlined by starlight and moon glow. But that shape was enough to tell me everything I needed to know about what had moved into my hollow. It stood on 2 legs. That was wrong, fundamentally wrong, because nothing that big should have been bipedal. 7 feet at minimum, maybe 8, maybe taller. I couldn't be sure from this distance, but it dwarfed the fence posts, made the trees behind it look like saplings. The shoulders were too broad, impossibly muscled, sloping down into arms that hung past where human arms should have ended. The hands, if they were hands, were massive, visible even in silhouette as dark shapes that could have wrapped around my skull with room to spare. And the head. God help me, the head. It wasn't human, it wasn't wolf, wasn't bear, wasn't any creature that had a right to exist in a world governed by natural law. The skull was elongated, canine in shape but stretched and distorted, housing a brain that must have been enormous. The ears rose to points that twitched and rotated, scanning the hollow, and even in that flat, black outline, I could see the suggestion of a muzzle, a snout, jaws that could have taken a man's arm off at the shoulder. It stood at my fence line and looked at my house. Not toward my house, at my window, at me. I felt its attention like a physical weight, pressing against the glass, pressing against my sanity. Those eyes weren't reflecting moonlight, not from this distance, but I could feel them anyway, could feel them finding me, fixing on me, measuring me against some standard I couldn't begin to understand. The creature was absolutely still. That was the worst part somehow. That complete absence of movement, of restlessness, of the small shifts that living things make just by existing. It stood at my fence line like a statue carved from darkness itself, and it watched me, and it waited. I don't know what it was waiting for. Permission, maybe? A sign of weakness, some signal that would tell it whether to approach or retreat. to attack or observe, to end me or let me continue my small and terrified existence. Whatever that signal was, I didn't give it. I couldn't give it because I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stand at my window and stare at the thing that had no business existing, the thing that had turned my hollow into a hunting ground and my home into a cage. We stayed like that for what felt like hours. Me at the window, it at the fence, the moon sliding across the sky, indifferent to the impossibility unfolding beneath it. Then the creature turned and walked back into the trees. It moved wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. The gait was too smooth, too efficient, as if the laws of physics that governed motion for every other creature had been suspended for this one. There was no wasted movement, no awkwardness, no suggestion that a body that size should have struggled with the simple act of walking. It flowed back into the darkness of the forest like water flowing downhill, natural and inevitable and utterly horrifying. And then it was gone. I stayed at the window until dawn. I couldn't make myself move, couldn't trust my legs to carry me to the bed, couldn't close my eyes and lose sight of the fence line, even though there was nothing there anymore. The shape I'd seen was burned into my retinas, playing on loop every time I blinked. That impossible silhouette outlined in silver light. When the sun finally came up, I went to the phone and called Earl Whitaker. "I need you to come over," I said. My voice was steady, which surprised me. "I need to show you something." Earl came within the hour, his ancient pickup rattling up my drive, his face wearing the concerned expression of a man who's just been asked to do something he doesn't understand. I walked him out to the fence line, to the exact spot where the creature had stood and pointed at the ground. The prints were there, larger than my hand, deeper than any impression I'd ever seen in this soil, pressed into the earth with a weight that must have been enormous. They weren't quite wolf, weren't quite bear, weren't quite anything I could name. The toes ended in curved depressions that could only have been claws. Earl looked at them for a long time. His face went through several expressions: confusion, denial, fear, and finally something that might have been understanding. "You've seen it," he said. It wasn't a question. 3 nights now, eyes at first. Then this. He nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to tell stories, things in the woods, old things, older than the settlement. She always said they had territories, boundaries they wouldn't cross, lines drawn by something older than property deeds. Said as long as you stayed inside the hollow, you were in their world. But if you could make it past the ridge..." He trailed off, shaking his head. I always thought those were just stories to scare children. Doesn't matter what I thought. "What do we do?" Earl looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the same fear I felt, the same desperate hope that there was an answer, a solution, a way to make this right. "I don't know," he said, "but I don't think it's going away." He left shortly after, and I stood at the fence line, looking at those prints until the afternoon sun baked them into obscurity. Part of me wanted to take photographs, to document the evidence, to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined everything. But another part of me didn't want proof, didn't want to look at those prints on a screen and be forced to accept what they meant. I told myself it was a bear, a very large bear, walking upright the way they sometimes did, distorted by moonlight and fear into something it wasn't. I told myself the prints were old, probably weeks old, that they'd just happened to be in the same spot where I'd seen the silhouette. Coincidence, nothing more. I almost made myself believe it. I lay in bed that night, lamp blazing, rifle on the mattress beside me, and I repeated the rational explanation like a prayer. Just a bear. Just a very large bear. Just a bear. But the bears in these mountains didn't walk like that, didn't stand that still, didn't have heads shaped like nightmares, silhouettes that made the forest look small, and bears didn't look at you like they knew exactly what you were, like they were making decisions about your future with the same casual interest you might give to a beetle crossing the kitchen floor. Whatever was in my hollow, it wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal that belonged in the natural order of things. It was something else entirely. Something that had been watching me for nearly 3 weeks now, studying me, learning the patterns of my small and fragile life. Something that could have killed me a dozen times over and had chosen, for its own unknowable reasons, not to. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the night after either. I just lay in my bed watching the window, waiting for a shape to appear against the stars, waiting for eyes to find me in the darkness. And somewhere out in the hollow, beyond the fence line, beyond the trees, something was waiting too. Something patient. Something old. Something that knew exactly where I was and exactly what I was and exactly how easy I would be to catch if it ever decided that catching me was what it wanted to do. The worst part wasn't the fear. The worst part was the uncertainty, because I still didn't know what it wanted. And until I did, I couldn't do anything but wait for it to make the next move. The next move came 3 nights later. I'd settled into a routine of exhaustion by then, catching sleep in fragments during the daylight hours when the sun felt like protection, when I could tell myself that nothing would come for me while the world was bright and ordinary. I'd stopped going to the mine, called in sick the first day, then the second, and by the third, I just stopped calling. Let them think what they wanted. Let them fire me if it came to that. I couldn't leave the hollow after dark. Couldn't risk being caught on that winding mountain road with nothing but darkness on either side and no guarantee I'd make it to the other end. The dogs had stopped eating. Rufus would nose at his food bowl and then look at me with those mournful eyes, and Belle wouldn't even do that much. They spent their days pressed against the back door, trembling, occasionally letting out small whines that might have been pleas for me to do something to fix whatever had broken in their world. I couldn't fix it. I couldn't even understand it. I was in the barn that evening, checking on the remaining livestock almost out of habit. The cows had been restless for days, clustering in the far corner of their stalls, eyes rolling white whenever a shadow passed outside the windows. The chickens had stopped laying entirely, even the barn cats, those fearless mousers who'd faced down snakes and foxes without flinching, had vanished somewhere into the walls and refused to come out. The lantern threw dancing shadows across the walls as I moved between stalls, and I told myself the shadows were just shadows, that the darkness pooling in the corners was just the absence of light, nothing more. I'd gotten good at lying to myself. It was the only way I could function. I was checking the water trough when I heard it. Not a sound exactly, more like an absence of sound, a sudden vacuum of silence that made my ears ring. The cow nearest me went absolutely still, her head swinging toward the far wall, her nostrils flaring with each rapid breath. I followed her gaze and saw nothing but aged oak planks, the wood darkened by decades of use, the gaps between boards showing nothing but the night beyond. Then one of the boards moved, not fell, not was pushed, moved, bending inward like something was pressing against it from outside, testing its strength, measuring its resistance. I watched the wood flex, watched ancient nails groan in their holes, watched a crack spider across the grain from the pressure being applied. I raised the lantern. The light caught something in the gap between boards. Just a sliver of visibility, just a narrow window into the darkness outside. But it was enough. I saw fur first. Not the smooth pelt of a wolf or the shaggy coat of a bear, but something in between. Something matted and coarse and the color of storm clouds. Gray-brown and bristling with a texture that looked wrong, that looked like it belonged on something from a fever dream, rather than anything that walked the natural world. The fur was moving, not with wind, not with the creature's breathing, but with something else, some subtle undulation that made my stomach clench and my throat go tight. It was like watching hair grow and fast forward, like seeing something that shouldn't be alive demonstrating just how alive it really was. I couldn't look away. The gap in the boards was maybe 2 inches wide, maybe 3 at the most. But through it, I could see more than I wanted to. The fur gave way to skin at one point. Pale skin, almost gray, stretched tight over what might have been a wrist or an ankle, hairless and wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The skin looked old. Not aged, not wrinkled, but old in some deeper sense, like it had existed for longer than skin was meant to exist, like it remembered times before there were words for what it was. Then I saw the hand. It was pressed against the outside of the board. Fingers splayed wide, and each finger ended in a claw that curved back toward the palm like a raptor's talon. The claws were black, gleaming wet in the lantern light, and they were longer than any claw had a right to be, longer than my fingers, curved to a point that looked sharp enough to open me from throat to groin without effort. But it was the fingers themselves that made my breath stop in my chest. They were too long, too jointed. I counted the knuckles without meaning to, and there were too many of them. 4 or 5 where there should have been 3, giving each finger an extra segment of movement, an extra degree of flexibility. They moved against the wood with a delicacy that seemed obscene, tapping lightly against the grain like a musician testing keys, and I understood with horrible clarity that this thing could manipulate objects, could open doors, could work the locks I'd installed on every entrance to the house. The hand withdrew from the gap, and for a moment I thought it was leaving, thought maybe my presence with the lantern had been enough to drive it away. But then something else appeared in that narrow window of visibility. A snout, long and canine, covered in that same wrong fur, lips pulled back to reveal teeth that gleamed in the lantern light. Not a wolf's teeth, though they were shaped that way. Too many of them, crowded together in a jaw that was too large, too deep, too clearly made for tearing rather than chewing. The gums were black. The tongue that briefly appeared between those teeth was nearly purple, and there was something about the way the mouth moved that suggested it could do more than just bite. It could speak, I thought. I don't know where that thought came from, but I was suddenly certain of it. That mouth could form words if it wanted to. It just chose not to. The snout pressed against the gap, nostrils flaring, and I heard it inhale, a long, slow sound that seemed to go on forever, drawing in my scent, cataloging it, memorizing it. Then the snout withdrew, and for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, I saw an eye. That same terrible color, sulfurous and bilious, like something rotting from within. But this close, I could see details I'd missed at a distance. The pupil wasn't round like a human's or slit like a cat's. It was something in between, a shape that I don't have words for, a geometry that didn't belong in the natural world. And around that pupil, in the yellow-green iris, I could see something that looked almost like writing. Patterns that might have been random but felt deliberate. Symbols that my brain tried to read and couldn't, that made my head hurt and my vision blur just from the attempt. The eye held mine for an eternity. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare into that wrong pupil and feel something staring back. Something old, something patient, something that was looking at me the way I might look at a calf I was deciding whether to slaughter or keep for breeding. Then the eye blinked once, slowly, and was gone. I stood frozen for I don't know how long. The lantern shook in my hand, sending shadows dancing across the walls, making the whole barn feel like it was moving, breathing, alive with the thing's presence, even though it wasn't there anymore. The cow behind me let out a sound that wasn't quite a moo, something closer to a whimper, something that said she'd seen what I'd seen and understood it just as little. When I could finally move, I ran. Not out of the barn. I wasn't that stupid, wasn't about to go outside where it might be waiting, but deeper into the barn, into the corner where the tools were kept, where my grandfather's old axe hung on the wall next to rusted saws and forgotten machinery. I grabbed the axe and held it in front of me like a talisman. The wooden handle, slick with my sweat, the blade catching the lantern light, put it with what I desperately hoped was menace. It wasn't coming through the wall. Not yet. But I'd seen those hands, those claws, and I knew the barn walls wouldn't stop it if it really wanted in. Century-old oak meant nothing to something like that. The locks on my doors meant nothing. The rifle by my bed, the axe in my hands, the fence around my property, all of it meant nothing. I was meat, and it was the butcher. And the only reason I was still breathing was because it hadn't finished deciding how it wanted to carve me up. I made it back to the house without incident, though the walk felt like miles instead of yards. Every shadow a potential threat. Every rustle of wind in the trees a prelude to attack. The dogs were pressed against the door when I got there, their bodies blocking the entrance, until I practically had to shove them aside to get in. They didn't protest. They just looked at me with those terrified eyes, and then immediately plastered themselves against my legs, trembling so hard I could feel their heartbeats through their fur. I locked every door, checked every window, pulled the curtains tight, and pushed furniture against the front and back entrances, knowing even as I did it, that none of it would matter. That if the thing wanted in, it would come in. And all my barricades would do is slow it down by a few seconds. Then I sat in the kitchen with the lantern blazing and the rifle across my knees and waited for dawn. Dawn came eventually. Dawn always does. But the daylight brought no comfort this time, because in the light of morning I walked around the outside of the barn and saw what the thing had left for me to find. Claw marks. Not just where I'd seen it pressing against the boards, but everywhere. Every surface within reach, scored deep with parallel gouges that exposed the pale wood beneath the weathered gray exterior. The marks went all the way around the barn, circling the building like some kind of perverse ritual, and in places they overlapped, creating patterns that might have been random or might have been something else. something deliberate, something that my brain shied away from trying to interpret. It had walked around my barn all night, marking it, claiming it, and in the mud near the back corner, I found more prints, the same ones Earl and I had seen near the fence line, but fresher, deeper, accompanied by something new. Drag marks that led from the barn to the tree line, and at the end of those drag marks, a pile of feathers and blood that had once been one of my chickens. It had taken something of mine, fed on something that belonged to me. I knew what that meant, even if I didn't want to admit it. The hollow was its territory now. The farm was its territory. And I was just another part of the livestock, another creature living on its land, tolerated for now, but ultimately belonging to it in every way that mattered. I found more signs over the following days. I couldn't stop looking for them, couldn't stop myself from checking every corner of my property for evidence of its passage, even though each discovery made the truth more unbearable. Scratch marks on the underside of the porch, where something had tested the floorboards from below while I slept. Tufts of that gray-brown fur caught on the barbed wire fence, too high for any normal animal to reach. A dead deer in the upper pasture, its throat torn out but its body otherwise untouched. Not fed on, just killed. A message maybe, a warning, a demonstration of what it could do. And on my back porch, arranged in a neat line, 3 of my chicken's eggs, unbroken, placed there carefully by hands that could have crushed them without effort, but had chosen instead to display them like an offering, like a gift, like something a cat might bring to its owner to show affection. That was the detail that broke me. Not the violence, not the death, not the marks of its presence carved into every surface of my home. The eggs, the careful, deliberate, almost tender placement of those eggs, as if it was trying to communicate something, as if it wanted me to understand that it knew me, understood my life, had been watching closely enough to know that I valued those eggs, that I gathered them each morning, that they represented something about my routine and my survival. It knew me. It had been learning me, and it wanted me to know that it knew. I tried to leave the hollow that day, packed a bag, loaded the dogs into the truck, made it almost to the ridge before the engine died. No warning, no gradual failure, just a sudden, complete cessation of power. The truck rolling to a stop on the narrow mountain road, with the tree line pressing close on both sides. I turned the key, heard the starter click uselessly, turned it again and again while the dogs whined in the back seat and the shadows under the trees seemed to lean closer with each passing second. The truck had been running fine. I'd had it serviced 3 months ago, had replaced the battery just last fall, had never had so much as a hiccup from the engine in all the years I'd owned it. But now it sat dead on the road, trapping me halfway between my hollow and the outside world, too far from home to walk in daylight, and too close to the trees for comfort. I sat in that truck for an hour trying to make the engine turn over, watching the sun arc across the sky and calculating how long I had before darkness fell. The dogs grew more agitated as the minutes passed, their whines escalating to full-throated howls, their bodies pressing against the windows like they were trying to escape something I couldn't see. Then Belle went silent. Not calm, not asleep. Silent in that absolute, terrible way that only happens when an animal is too afraid to make any sound at all, when instinct takes over and says that making noise means drawing attention and Drawing attention means death. She was staring out the rear window, her body rigid, her eyes fixed on something in the trees behind us. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Some part of me knew that if I looked, if I saw it there in the daylight, in the hours when I was supposed to be safe, then the last of my illusions would shatter and I'd be left with nothing but the truth of what was hunting me. Instead, I got out of the truck. I left the dogs inside, left the key in the ignition, and I walked, not back toward my hollow, not forward toward the world beyond, but sideways, into the trees, toward a path I remembered from childhood, a shortcut that would take me to Earl's place if I was fast enough and lucky enough, and if whatever was watching from the shadows decided to let me go, I didn't run. Running felt like the wrong thing to do, like something that would trigger a chase response, like something that would turn me from a curiosity into prey. Instead, I walked at a steady pace, my feet finding the half-remembered path through undergrowth that had grown thick in the years since I'd last used it, my hands hanging loose at my sides, because I didn't have a weapon and knew that having one wouldn't matter anyway. Behind me, I heard the truck start. The engine turned over with a healthy roar, idling smoothly as if nothing had ever been wrong with it. I stopped walking, turned, saw my truck sitting on the road, running perfectly, with both dogs still inside and no one in the driver's seat. It could have taken them. While I was walking away, while my back was turned, it could have opened the doors and taken my dogs, and there would have been nothing I could do about it. But it hadn't. It had started my truck instead, given me a way out. Or was it showing me that it controlled whether I could leave? That my truck, my transportation, my only real connection to the world beyond the hollow, was as much under its power as everything else in my life? I walked back to the truck slowly, each step feeling like a gamble, like a test of whether I was reading the situation correctly or walking into a trap. The dogs were hysterical when I opened the door, scrambling over each other to get to me, pressing their bodies against mine with desperate need. I climbed behind the wheel and sat there for a long moment, hands shaking, breath coming in short gasps, coming in. Then I drove back to the hollow. I don't know why. Maybe because the message was clear. I wasn't leaving until it allowed me to leave, and trying to run would only make things worse. Maybe because some stubborn part of me refused to abandon my grandfather's land, the farm that had been in my family for 4 generations, the only home I'd ever really known. Maybe because I understood, on some level I couldn't articulate, that running wouldn't matter, that wherever I went, it would find me, that the only choice I had was between facing it on familiar ground or facing it somewhere strange and alone. Or maybe I was just too tired to think clearly anymore. I spent the rest of that day trying to reach someone, anyone who might be able to help. I called Earl, but his wife said he'd gone into town and wouldn't be back until tomorrow. I called my cousin Ray, but he laughed when I tried to explain what was happening and asked if I'd been drinking. I called the game warden, left a message that probably sounded deranged, got no call back. I even called my ex-wife, desperate enough to try anyone. But she didn't answer, and I couldn't bring myself to leave a voicemail explaining that a monster was stalking me through the West Virginia hills. No one was coming. No one could help. As night fell, I realized that I was completely, absolutely alone. The hollow was quiet in a way that felt wrong. No insects, no night birds, no distant howls of coyotes or the rustle of deer moving through the underbrush. Just silence, vast and empty and pressing against the walls of my house, like a physical weight. I sat in the kitchen again, rifle ready, lantern burning, waiting. The attack came around midnight. Not the full assault I'd been expecting, not the thing crashing through my walls to tear me apart. Something worse, in a way, something more deliberate. A knock at the back door. 3 slow, measured knocks, spaced evenly apart, with pauses between them that felt almost playful. The sound of something that wasn't human mimicking human behavior, trying on our rituals like a costume that didn't quite fit. I didn't answer, didn't move, just sat frozen with the rifle across my knees and my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Another 3 knocks, patient, unhurried. Then a sound that I will hear in my nightmares until the day I die. A voice. Not words, not exactly. More like the shape of words, the rhythm of human speech without the actual content. A series of sounds that rose and fell like sentences but meant nothing. Like someone learning to talk by listening through walls, like something trying to figure out how mouths worked and not quite getting it right. The voice went on for what felt like hours, rising and falling, stopping and starting, occasionally producing sounds that were almost recognizable. My name, maybe, or the names of my dogs, or words that might have been questions if they'd been formed by human lips. I sat rigid in my chair, not daring to breathe too loudly, knowing that the door wouldn't stop it if it wanted in, knowing that this entire display was for my benefit, that it was showing me how much it had learned, how closely it had been watching. Then silence. A silence that stretched and stretched until I almost convinced myself it was over, that it had left, that I might somehow survive until morning. Then, softly, almost gently, I heard it whisper my name. Not an approximation. Not a garbled attempt at human speech. My name, clear and precise, in a voice that sounded like gravel and broken glass and something ancient trying to remember what it had been like to speak. It knew my name. It had learned to say my name, and in that moment, I understood with perfect clarity that I was not going to escape. That this thing, whatever it was, had decided something about me, had made a choice that I wasn't party to, had looked at my small and fragile life and selected me for some purpose I couldn't begin to comprehend. I was no longer just aware that it was watching me. Now I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that it had been studying me, learning me, and whatever it had learned, whatever decision it had reached, the next move was coming soon. The night stretched on, empty and silent, and I sat in my kitchen waiting for a dawn that felt like it might never come. Dawn came eventually, pale and gray and offering no comfort. I hadn't slept, hadn't moved from my chair except to check that the lantern still had fuel, that the rifle was still loaded, that the doors were still intact. The thing outside had gone silent sometime around 4 a.m, withdrawing into whatever darkness had spawned it. And I'd sat there in the growing light, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined everything, that exhaustion and fear had combined to create auditory hallucinations, that there was no way something had stood on my back porch and whispered my name in a voice that sounded like it had been dredged up from the bottom of a coal mine. But I knew better. I knew what I'd heard. The day passed in a fog of exhaustion and dread. I went through the motions of my routine, fed the chickens, checked on the remaining livestock, made coffee that I couldn't drink because my hands were shaking too badly to hold the cup steady. Earl's truck pulled into my drive around noon, and I stood on the porch, watching him approach with the rifle still in my hands, my finger resting against the trigger guard, my eyes scanning the tree line behind him like something might come boiling out of the shadows at any moment. "Jesus, Sebastian," Earl said, stopping short when he saw my face. "You look like death warmed over. You get any sleep at all?" "Something came to my door last night," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, flat and distant, like I was listening to someone else speak. It knocked. It tried to talk. Earl's expression shifted from concern to something more complicated. Worry mixed with skepticism, the look you give someone you've known your whole life when they start saying things that don't make sense. "What do you mean, tried to talk? What knocked?" "I don't know what it is," I said, "but it's been watching me, following me. It knows my name, Earl. It said my name." He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with those sharp blue eyes that had seen their own share of hard living. Then he sighed and ran a hand through his thinning hair. "You've been sleeping? Eating?" Sometimes when a man gets worn down enough, his mind starts playing tricks on... It's not tricks. I cut him off, more sharply than I intended. "Your goats wouldn't go near the upper pasture. The deer are gone. The dogs won't leave the porch after dark. You've seen it too, even if you won't admit it." Something flickered across his face then. Recognition, maybe, or the echo of his own unspoken fears. He glanced toward the tree line just for a second, but I caught it. He knew something was wrong with the hollow. He just wasn't ready to name it. "I think you should come stay with me and Martha for a few days," he said finally. "Get some rest. Let your head clear." "I can't leave. If I leave, it follows. I tried already." Earl's jaw tightened. He didn't ask what I meant by that, didn't press for details. Maybe he saw something in my eyes that told him the full explanation would be worse than not knowing. After a long pause, he just nodded slowly. "You call if you need anything, anything at all, day or night." Then he got back in his truck and drove away, and I watched the dust settle behind him and knew that I was alone again. That whatever happened next, I would face it by myself. The rest of the day crawled past. I brought the lanterns into the kitchen, checked my ammunition, reinforced the back door as best I could with what lumber I had on hand. None of it would matter if the thing decided to come through the walls. But the work gave my hands something to do, gave my mind something to focus on besides the waiting. As the sun began to sink toward the western ridge, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that should have been beautiful but instead looked like blood spreading across water, I felt the fear settle into my bones like cold seeping through a cracked window. This was it. Whatever was going to happen, it would happen tonight. I was as certain of that as I'd ever been certain of anything in my life. The hollow went silent at dusk. Not gradually, not the natural quieting of day creatures giving way to night ones. Just silent, all at once, like someone had thrown a switch. One moment I could hear the distant call of a whippoorwill and the soft rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. The next, nothing. Absolute stillness. Rufus and Belle had been on the porch, pressed against the front door, whining softly. When the silence fell, they went rigid. Rufus let out a low, broken whine that rose into something close to a scream, and both dogs bolted. Not toward the house, not toward me, but away, down the hollow road toward Earl's place, running like their lives depended on it. Maybe they did. I watched them go. I didn't try to call them back. The hours crept past. I sat in my kitchen with the lantern burning and the rifle across my knees, and waited for whatever was coming. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat, could hear the blood rushing in my ears, could hear the tiny sounds of my own body trying to keep me alive for just a little while longer. It was almost a relief when I heard it. The barn. Something was moving in the barn. Not the soft sounds of my remaining cattle shifting in their stalls. This was different. Heavy footsteps, deliberate pacing. The creak of old boards under significant weight. The rustle of something brushing against the walls as it moved. Whatever was in there, it wanted me to hear it. It wanted me to know it was there. I could have stayed in the house. Could have barricaded myself in the kitchen and waited for dawn and prayed that the walls would hold. But I knew, with the same bone-deep certainty that had been growing in me for weeks, that hiding wouldn't save me, that whatever was in that barn had already made its decision about me, and my only chance, if I had any chance at all, was to face it on my feet rather than cowering behind locked doors. So I took my grandfather's rifle and I walked out into the night. The yard was empty. The moon was full and bright, casting sharp shadows across the packed earth, illuminating the path to the barn with pale silver light. Every step felt like walking through water, like the air itself was trying to hold me back, to warn me away from what waited ahead. I ignored it. I kept walking. The barn door stood open. I didn't remember leaving it that way. I was certain I'd closed it when I did the evening feeding, certain I'd thrown the heavy wooden bolt that my grandfather had installed 40 years ago. But now it hung open, the darkness inside so complete that not even the moonlight seemed willing to penetrate it. I raised the rifle, thumbed off the safety, took a breath that felt like it might be my last. Then I stepped inside. For a moment there was nothing but darkness and the thick smell of hay and livestock and something else underneath. Something musky and wrong, like rotting meat mixed with wet dog, and the copper tang of old blood. The lantern I'd left hanging by the door was dark. The oil hadn't run out. Something had extinguished it. I stood just inside the threshold, letting my eyes adjust, straining to see into the shadows that pooled in every corner. I heard it breathing before I saw it. Deep, slow breaths, each one lasting longer than any animal's lungs should have been able to hold. The sound came from the back of the barn, from the shadows beyond the cattle stalls, from a darkness that seemed to move and shift even though there was no wind. I raised the rifle, sighted down the barrel toward the sound, and waited. Then it moved. One moment it was hidden in the darkness, just another shadow among shadows. The next it was coming toward me, and I saw it, truly saw it, for the first time. It came through the back wall of the barn like the wall wasn't there, splintering century-old oak beams and sending planks flying in all directions. The sound was catastrophic, the crack and groan of wood being torn apart by something that shouldn't exist, and beneath it I could hear a deeper sound, a rumbling growl that seemed to resonate in my chest, like the bass note of some terrible organ. It stood upright. That was the first thing I processed, the detail that my shocked brain latched onto as it tried to make sense of what it was seeing. It stood on two legs like a man, but it was not a man. Had never been a man, was something so far beyond human that the comparison felt obscene. It was massive, 8 feet tall at least, maybe 9, its head nearly brushing the rafters of the barn. Its body was covered in coarse, matted fur, the color of dead leaves and old blood, gray-brown and patchy in places, revealing pale skin underneath that looked wrong somehow, too smooth, too human. The shoulders were impossibly broad, The chest deep and muscular, the arms hanging past its knees, with hands that ended in curved black claws the length of my fingers. Each claw gleamed in the thin moonlight filtering through the hole it had made, sharp and hooked and designed for tearing flesh from bone. But the face, God help me, the face. It was a wolf's face stretched over a human skull, the proportions wrong in ways that made my eyes ache to look at. The snout was long and filled with teeth, dozens of teeth, too many teeth, crowding each other in a mouth that seemed to split its entire head when it opened. The ears were pointed and swiveling, tracking sounds I couldn't hear, and the eyes, those jaundiced, bile-colored eyes that I'd seen in the tree line, that I'd seen reflected in my flashlight beam. The eyes were watching me with an intelligence that was worse than animal hunger, worse than predatory instinct. There was thought behind those eyes, calculation, something ancient and patient and utterly alien, studying me the way I might study an insect before deciding whether to crush it. Its breath fogged in the cold night air, each exhale carrying the stench of carrion and something older, something that smelled like caves and deep places and the kind of rot that takes centuries to accumulate. Muscles slid beneath that terrible pelt as it shifted its weight, lowering its head to bring its face closer to mine, and I heard that sound again, the approximation of human speech, rising and falling in patterns that were almost recognizable, almost words. My name. It was saying my name again, over and over, wrapped in that gravel and glass voice, and something in the tone was almost curious. I fired. The rifle kicked against my shoulder, the report deafening in the enclosed space of the barn, and I saw the round hit, saw the fur ripple, saw the creature stagger back half a step, saw dark blood well up from a wound in its chest. I worked the lever, chambered another round, fired again. This time the bullet took it in the shoulder, spinning it slightly, drawing a sound from its throat that might have been pain or might have been something else entirely. It didn't fall. It didn't even seem particularly bothered. It turned those yellow eyes back to me, and its mouth split open in what I can only describe as a smile. A terrible, impossible smile full of all those teeth. Blood dripping from the wounds I'd inflicted, and it laughed. Not a human laugh, not really, but close enough that I understood the meaning. It was amused. I had heard it, and it was amused. Then it moved. I don't know how something that big moved that fast. One moment it was 10 feet away, blood trickling down its chest, and the next it was on top of me, one massive hand closing around my shoulder and lifting me off my feet like I weighed nothing at all. The claws punctured my jacket, punctured my skin, and I felt blood running hot down my arm as the creature brought its face close to mine. Its breath washed over me thick and rotten, and up close, I could see details I wished I couldn't. The yellowed teeth, the black gums, the intelligence in those eyes, the way its nostrils flared as it smelled me, really smelled me, learning my scent in a way that felt more intimate than any touch. It was studying me. Even now, even in this moment of absolute dominance, it was studying me. I don't know where the presence of mind came from. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the blind luck of a man with nothing left to lose. But I still had the rifle in my hands, and I jammed the barrel against its chest, right where the first round had hit, right where the wound was still seeping dark blood, and I pulled the trigger. The creature screamed. Not a howl, not a growl. A scream high and piercing and full of genuine pain. Its grip on my shoulder loosened, just for an instant, and I twisted free, fell hard on the barn floor, scrambled backward through the hay and the blood and the scattered planks toward the door. I didn't try to reload, didn't try to fight. I just ran. Out of the barn, across the yard, the moonlight bright enough to see by, my shoulder screaming with every stride. I didn't go for the house. The house wouldn't stop it, nothing would stop it. I went for the truck. Keys still in my pocket, keys I'd kept on me for days now, knowing that at some point escape might be my only option. Behind me, I heard the barn wall explode outward as it came after me. I made it to the truck, yanked the door open, threw myself behind the wheel, jammed the key in the ignition with hands that were slick with my own blood. The engine turned over, caught, roared to life, and I slammed it into gear and floored the accelerator just as something massive and dark filled the rearview mirror. The truck fishtailed on the packed earth, tires screaming, and then I was moving, flying down the hollow road, faster than I'd ever driven in my life. Behind me, through the rear window, I could see it, running on all fours now, covering ground at an impossible pace, gaining on me despite my speed. I didn't slow down, didn't look back, just drove. The hollow road wound up toward the main ridge, toward the county road, toward the world outside this little pocket of darkness that had become my prison. I took the curves too fast, felt the truck slide on the gravel, corrected, kept going. The speedometer climbed. 40, 50, 60, and still I could see it in my mirrors, still gaining those sick lantern eyes, burning in the darkness like hellfire. Then I crested the ridge, crossed some invisible line, and it stopped. It stopped dead at the boundary of the hollow, standing upright again, watching me drive away. I could see it clearly in my mirrors, silhouetted against the moonlit sky, massive and terrible and utterly still. It didn't try to follow. It just stood there, watching, until the road curved and the trees blocked my view, and I was alone on the dark highway with nothing but my terror and my blood and the pain in my shoulder to prove that any of it had really happened. I drove for 3 hours. Didn't stop, didn't slow down, just drove until the adrenaline faded and the blood loss caught up with me, and I realized I was going to pass out if I didn't pull over. I ended up in the parking lot of a 24-hour truck stop somewhere in Virginia, slumped over the steering wheel, bleeding through my jacket, unable to move. The paramedics came eventually. Someone saw the blood, called 911, and then there were lights and sirens and people asking me questions I couldn't answer. I told them it was an animal attack. What else could I say? And they loaded me into an ambulance and took me to a hospital where doctors stitched up my shoulder and pumped me full of antibiotics and asked if I knew what kind of animal had claws that size. I said I didn't. I spent 2 days in that hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness, watching the door of my room like something might come through it at any moment. The official report listed the incident as an attack by an unidentified large predator, probably a bear, and recommended I contact wildlife services when I returned home. I never returned home. Earl came to see me on the second day, looking older than I'd ever seen him, his face drawn and gray. He didn't ask what had happened. He just sat by my bed for a long while, and then he said, very quietly, that he and Martha were thinking about moving too, that the hollow didn't feel right anymore, that his goats still wouldn't go near the upper pasture, and something had killed 3 of his chickens the night after I left. killed them and left them arranged in a circle facing his house, like they were watching, like they were waiting for him to find them. He said the pattern looked deliberate, not the random scatter of a predator's feeding, but something placed with intention, with meaning. I told him to sell the farm, sell everything and get out. He nodded like he'd already been thinking the same thing. Before he left, I asked about the dogs. Earl's face softened with something like relief. Rufus and Belle showed up at our place that night, half dead from running. Martha's been feeding them ever since. They won't go outside after dark, but they're alive. He paused. They're yours if you want them back. I shook my head. Those dogs had the good sense to run when running mattered. They deserved better than a man who was still looking over his shoulder, still flinching at shadows. Keep them, I said. They're safer with you. Over the following weeks, I tried once to file a proper report, sat down with a wildlife officer in a Virginia field office, and started to explain what I'd seen. The words came out wrong. They had to, because there were no right words for what had happened. And I watched his expression change from professional attention to barely concealed skepticism, to the particular kind of concern you reserve for people who might be dangerous. I stopped talking, thanked him for his time, left. After that, I didn't try to tell anyone else. What would I say? That a creature out of nightmares had stalked me through the West Virginia hills, had learned my name, had whispered it through my door in the dead of night, that I'd shot it 3 times and it had laughed, that it had let me go, because I knew with absolute certainty that it had allowed my escape, that if it had truly wanted to catch me, it would have caught me, that I had survived, not through my own skill or luck, but through the inexplicable decision of something that could have killed me at any point during those terrible weeks. No one would believe me. And honestly, I'm not sure I'd believe me either if I hadn't lived through it. I sold my grandfather's farm 3 months later. Took a loss, a significant loss, because I wanted it done quickly and didn't have the energy to negotiate. The livestock went to Earl before he moved away himself, and the land went to a development company from Charleston that wanted the mineral rights but never did anything with the property. Last I heard, it's still sitting empty, the house slowly rotting back into the hollow. The barn never rebuilt after whatever story they told themselves about what had destroyed it. I transferred to a different mine, applied for a position in West Virginia, a good 100 miles from the hollow, and moved into a rented trailer in a subdivision that had been carved out of what used to be farmland. No trees, no forests, just rows of identical homes on flat, open ground where you could see anything coming from a mile away. The trailer has security glass in every window. I had it installed myself, paid extra for the reinforced frames. I sleep with the lights on, every light in the place burning all night. Running up electric bills I can barely afford on my mining salary. I don't own dogs anymore. I couldn't stand to watch another animal cower in fear of something I couldn't protect it from. My ex-wife, Linda, called once after she heard I'd sold the farm. She thought I'd had a breakdown, some kind of delayed stress response to the divorce or the grinding years of working the mine and the land simultaneously. She offered to help me find a therapist, her voice careful and gentle the way you talk to someone you think might be fragile. I thanked her and said I was fine, and we haven't spoken since. Ray stopped calling after the 3rd time I refused to explain why I'd left. The last time we talked, he said I was acting crazy, that I was throwing away 4 generations of family history over nothing, that whatever animal had attacked me was probably, no, long gone by now. I told him he was probably right and hung up and never answered his calls again. The loneliness is the hardest part. Not the fear. You can learn to live with fear, can wrap it around yourself like a familiar coat until it becomes just another part of who you are. But the loneliness, the knowledge that you've seen something that sets you apart from everyone else, that you carry a truth no one will ever believe, that's the thing that wears you down. I'm 51 now. 9 years since that night in the barn. 9 years of working the mine and coming home to my empty trailer and lying awake in the bright fluorescent glow, listening for sounds outside my windows. 9 years of jumping at shadows, of taking the long way around any patch of woods, of feeling my heart rate spike every time I see a dog that looks a little too large or a little too knowing. Some nights I wake up certain I hear breathing outside. Heavy, slow breathing, each exhale lasting longer than it should. I get up, check the windows, check the doors, scan the empty yard with its security lights and its chain link fence and its complete absence of cover. There's never anything there. But I check anyway, every single time. I don't think I escaped. Not really. I think I was allowed to leave. I think that creature, whatever it was. And I've never found a name for it that felt right, never found any legend or story that quite matched what I saw. I think it made a choice about me that night. It studied me for weeks, learned everything about me, whispered my name through the door to show me how completely it knew me, and then it let me go. Why? I don't know. Maybe I wasn't what it was looking for. Maybe I passed some test I didn't know I was taking. Maybe it just wasn't hungry enough, or I wasn't interesting enough, or there's some logic to its actions that I'll never understand because I'm human and it's something older and stranger and beyond my comprehension. Or maybe it's not finished with me yet. That's the thought that keeps me awake most nights. The possibility that I wasn't released, that I was marked, that somewhere in those hills, in that hollow that no one's ever bought and no one ever will, something ancient and patient is waiting for the right moment to collect what it's owed. That my escape was temporary, a delay rather than a reprieve, and one night I'll wake to hear breathing outside my window and know that the waiting is over. I don't have much to show for my life anymore. No family, no close friends, no home that feels like home. Just a job that pays the bills and a trailer full of locks and lights and the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who hasn't really slept in almost a decade. Most days I feel like a ghost myself, going through the motions of living while the real me is still back in that barn, staring into those yellow eyes, waiting for the killing blow that never came. But I'm alive. Whatever else has happened, whatever else might still happen, I survived. I saw something that shouldn't exist, something that could have ended me as easily as I'd swat a fly, and I'm still here to tell about it. Rufus and Belle are still with Earl and Martha, last I heard. Older now, gray around their muzzles, but alive. Sometimes I think about visiting them. I never do. That has to count for something. The hollow sits empty. The tree line still holds its shadows. And somewhere in those hills, in the darkness between the trees, in the spaces where the old things live, something ancient is still watching, still waiting, still remembering my name.